Hello and welcome back to COP26. We've got this, the podcast series preparing you for the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26.
COP26, we got this. The podcast discussing the issues, ideas and debates behind the summit that will shape the future of our planet. Brought to you by the Australian National University and King's College London.
My name is Dr. Megan Bowman and I am an Associate Professor in Law and also Director of the Climate Law and Governance Centre at King's College London.
And my name is Dr. Will Grant. I'm from the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science at the Australian National University.
So climate change is described as a wicked problem. And the reason it gets that term is because its causes and its impacts are multiple and interrelated. There is no one silver bullet for solving climate change. And indeed, it will require all hands on deck to address it. Therefore, implementing the Paris Agreement means that success depends not only on geopolitical accord, but also multi-level and multi-sectoral action by stakeholders or actors or people or sectors or things beyond and within nation states. So all this requires that non-state actors, as we call them, so entities like cities, corporations, financial institutions, energy providers, civil society, Indigenous and local communities will need to take decisive action to help move us towards a low carbon and climate resilient world.
So this week, we're discussing the role of non-state actors in reaching the Paris climate targets. We'll also be discussing how Indigenous Australian communities are impacted by climate change and how we can incorporate their traditional knowledge and practices into effective climate adaptation strategies. Some of the key questions we're hoping to explore with our guests today are: how does the climate regime incorporate non-state actors? What are these entities doing to help or hinder the transition? What are their unique levers and also limits to affecting change? Could they be doing more, or should they be doing less? How are Indigenous Australian communities in Australia being impacted by climate change, and how can we incorporate their traditional knowledge and practices into effective climate adaptation strategies?
So today we have 4 incredible experts joining us to help navigate these issues, and I'm incredibly excited for amazing women to help guide us through this really important, really complex topic. We have Dr. Leslie-Anne Duvic-Paoli, who is a senior lecturer in environmental law and also Deputy Director of the Climate Law and Governance Centre at King's College London. She's a public international lawyer with expertise in international environmental law and climate and energy law, and she's also assistant editor for the Transnational Environmental Law Journal. Her book, entitled The Prevention Principle in International Environmental Law, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018.
Dr. Rebecca Pearse is a lecturer in environmental sociology at the Australian National University's School of Sociology and the Fenner School of Environment. Beck's current projects investigate the possibilities for rapid and just energy transition, with particular focus on land and labour relations. She's a chief investigator on 2 ARC discovery projects, decarbonising electricity and environmental justice and the making of just food and energy policy.
We also have Dr. Virginia Marshall, who is the inaugural Indigenous Postdoctoral Fellow with the Australian National University School of Regulation and Global Governance, also known as RegNet, and the Fenner School of Environment and Society. She is a practicing lawyer and duty solicitor, a former associate and researcher with the Federal Court of Australia in Sydney, and professional member of the New South Wales Law Society and Women's Lawyers Association of New South Wales. Virginia is also the winner of the W.E.H. Stanner Award for the best thesis by an Indigenous author titled A Web of Aboriginal Water Rights, examining the competing Aboriginal claim for water property rights and interests in Australia. Virginia is also co-investigator with an ARC linkage grant, Garuwanga, forming a competent authority to protect Indigenous knowledge.
Dr. Emily Barritt is a senior lecturer in law and co-director of the Transnational Law Institute at King's College London. Her expertise focuses on environmental democracy, access to justice, public participation, and climate change litigation. She runs a bespoke, award-winning course on courts and social change at Her Majesty's Prison, Belmarsh.
So Leslie-Anne, let's start with you. As a public international lawyer amongst us, how does the Paris Agreement incorporate non-state actors into the climate regime?
I think it's very striking when you attend a COP as an international lawyer and you realize that most of the people who are there actually do not attend the negotiations as such. They do not see the law being made. And I think it really shows that climate governance is not only taking part in the kind of formal negotiation rooms. Since the beginning of the climate regime, we've seen NGOs, businesses, local governments attending COPs as activists, as observers, and trying to influence the whole regime. I think what we've seen more recently, and in particular since 2014, is a better inclusion of the role of a definition of the role that non-state actors can have for this climate regime, not only as observers, but also, for instance, to monitor local action. So that's all part of this more bottom-up approach that we know defines the Paris Agreement. But I think at the end of the day, the Paris Agreement is still an international treaty designed for and by states. So the only subjects of international law under the Paris Agreement with full rights and obligations are states. We are in a system that is very politicized, and we've been talking about the geopolitics of climate change. But at the same time, I think, as you've said, climate change is a wicked problem. And so we cannot just rely on states because the states are not necessarily the problem. Corporations often are. They are not necessarily the solution either. Local governments can be, for instance. So this all leads to some, I think, tensions within the Paris system, where you have a system that is a system made for states, but at the same time, it's very important to include non-state actors.
So thinking about these non-state actors, civil society actors, your research has looked at how they can affect change. What are their unique levers and what are their limits to affecting change within this climate governance regime?
I think, of course, when we're talking about non-state actors, we're talking about very different entities. And I think they all have a very specific function and a very specific role. My research has been on citizens' assemblies on climate change. So these are groups of representative citizens who are selected by lots and are asked to make recommendations to governments about how to reduce emissions. And so we've seen in recent years that this type of forum is becoming more and more popular with national as well as local governments. And I think it's quite an interesting type of non-state actor because on the one hand, they are often mandated by policymakers. So they are very close to power if you compare it to other types of civil society actors. And that's a strength in terms of the influence that can have on lawmaking processes, but that can also be a disadvantage because they can be, for instance, manipulated by governments in order to reinforce the policies that they want to take anyways. But I think what is interesting about these actors is that it's not really a group of like-minded people with shared interests who come together. Instead, it's connecting people with very diverse and often contradicting views and asking them to deliberate, to explain their position, and then to try and find a socially acceptable position on how to respond to the climate emergency.
Which is extremely complex, I imagine. And what I find fascinating about this topic is that, as you say, Leslie-Anne, it is nation states that sign off on the international treaty. So I guess the buck stops and starts with them. But the only way to implement the treaty is through the activities of a variety of actors on the ground. And the civil society actor particularly is really potent, a really powerful example of that, and one that I think all of us can identify with. And Beck, I mean, that feeds into your work as well. Tell us about it. Tell us about your work. From your perspective, how are civil society actors, making noise? Are they making change?
Thank you for that question. I thought I might start with a little bit of a definition of what we think of when we say civil society. So the idea that I work with as a social scientist, a sociologist interested in social movements, as well as the political process of formulating policies on climate and energy is, well, civil society is a field. It's not a unified agent. And when we're thinking about moments like the COP26 at Glasgow, we can see that civil society, like nation states, operate on multiple levels. So civil society on a global level is constituted by multiple types of groups, identities with different interests. So I think it's really useful to think of civil society as an arena of conflict. And I'm very influenced by the types of thinking that come out of the lineage from Antonio Gramsci, an Italian socialist thinker in the early 20th century, thinking about civil society as an arena where hegemony might be reinforced. And by this, I mean the unison of economic ideas and political thinking, so a moral unity, as well as material interests coming together. But sometimes in civil society, you see people making noise, to use your phrase, as a form of objection, or maybe even building collective power to form a kind of counter-hegemony. So to give you an initial example of that, the very first research job I had was as a research assistant looking at something in Australia called the grassroots climate action movement. This is a movement that had a history in a way. A lot of people in it had come from earlier forms of movement, anti-nuclear, forest campaigning, as well as people who had been in established NGOs, non-government organisations campaigning on coal and climate. And at around the 2006 mark, they said, well, we're going to get together and say, if we want to get real about climate change, you need to have a plan on fossil fuels. And a lot of their practice, this is what we were interested in observing through ethnographic observation, was about forms of civil disobedience, but also forums like the citizen assemblies that Leslie-Anne is talking about, coming together and saying, as citizens, we want a program of action that deals with the problem of fossil fuel reliance. And I think those practices on the ground in countries like Australia can be thought of as part of that global civil society. The practices like climate camps are borrowed from the UK and Germany, and they start to circulate in other parts of the world. They're part of something that some people call climate justice movements. So there was a real experimentation at that time with making noise about fossil fuels, which I think illustrates a kind of attempt to create a different hegemonic idea about what it means to act on climate. So there's one example.
Incredibly exciting stuff. And I think, so we're seeing a real kind of melting pot on the stove, the global stove bubbling away. And I think what's so exciting about that is that we get different voices. We're getting different voices, I think, is what I'm hearing from both you, Beck, and Leslie-Anne, which is so very, very important to start having multiple narratives and not just the one dominant one. Exactly. So do you think, I'll put this both to Leslie-Anne and to Beck, could the civil society actor groups, as you have examined them and seen them, could they be doing more? Or do you think they should be doing less?
That's a difficult question. From my perspective, when I'm looking at climate assemblies, I think they are doing enough. I think what you see with citizens who are taking part in those assemblies is that they are doing a huge amount of work. It's a huge time commitment. They have to spend their weekends away from their families just to learn about a new problem, something that they have not really thought about before. So to get the knowledge that they need in order to make the recommendations of climate change, it's a huge mandate. It's a huge amount of work that they have to put in. And what we see is that they do it brilliantly, and they do more than they are asked to do, actually, because they engage widely with the community. They talk to their MPs, they talk to people in corporations, trying to understand what are the obstacles to reducing emissions. I think what we actually need to think about is more about how to integrate those innovations with traditional institutions. And that's not for citizens to do, that's for governments to think about what is the added value of those experiments as they still are today, and how do we actually link them to more traditional legal lawmaking processes.
It's an interesting question. To begin, for me, I think it's important to recognise where we're at. So we're in a very urgent situation with limited regulation of the major corporations that have been shown through a lot of knowledge work produced by NGOs and intellectuals in the academy, historically responsible for the problem. There's a reliance on quite problematic, in some areas, relatively weak market mechanisms and other forms of regulation. So we're not reining in the main sources of the problem. And this comes to another point I want to make, that civil society also involves corporate actors. Yeah. So there's a lot of literature that has documented the strategies of different coalitions of business actors. The famous example is the front-footed campaigns of the Global Climate Coalition, a consortium of the major oil and gas and heavy industry companies, mostly out of the US, that had a strategy immediately to try to undermine climate science. But they've also had other strategies that have been very successful in seeing off any compliance obligations in the national and international agreements on climate. It's not an accident that the word fossil fuels is not in the Paris Agreement. So, could those actors in civil society be doing less? I think so. There are forms of business activation that we might, however, have a different eye to. So today I went to a very interesting seminar run by a news site called Renew Economy, and they had entrepreneurs from the renewable energy sector talking about what they call an economic ecosystem that they're building from the bottom up to develop renewables. And that's something I'm interested in as someone who researches basically a rural economic development process, putting in big wind and solar utility facilities on rural land in Australia. That's not without its, debates and problems. We've also got a debate within the Farmers Federation about other issues related to climate and energy policy. But the point here is that when we talk about civil society, who's doing what, we also need to keep our eye on the role of corporate actors, because really we do have an agreement that is tilted towards their interests right now. And in this decade, we need to change their industries in quite dramatic ways. And this is really the underlying sort of big stake that we all have in strong agreements at every level and strong regulation.
Absolutely. Before we wind up this bit of conversation, I'd love to just ask one final question to both of you about your indicators of hope, because one of the key things that we're thinking about through this whole podcast series is obviously climate change is one of the greatest challenges that we face as a species. But we also want to draw stories of hope from your research, from the places of the climate governance and action landscape. What are the things that you point to as a good sign for things to come? Beck?
I think what gives me personal hope, and actually what the climate activists that we studied more than a decade ago now related as well, is that hope comes through action and the collective experience of solidarity and mutual understanding. Another way that we might put this is that hope is something that you go out and earn. This is an idea from Mari Heglar, a climate justice writer. So I really think that hope comes from the forms of creative practice, people coming together, developing a shared sense of what they want and articulating that collectively. So I really think that the school strike initiative that comes out of Greta Thunberg's work, but can also be understood as part of a longer history of collective refusal to participate in something that we feel is wrong. You know, the strike comes from the union movement, a withdrawal of labour when the exploitation of an employer is unreasonable and unconscionable. The students are taking that method and on a generational basis saying, you know, we want a much better course of action than what's being offered. So I really think that articulation of a youth refusal to accept business as usual is one of those kind of collective action initiatives that give me great hope and a sense that I can participate in something that has ambition.
I love that. Leslie-Anne?
Well, I think I completely agree with that. I think what gives me hope is the fact that recently we've really seen citizens trying to push their governments for action. And I think this is a huge difference from a few years ago. And sometimes it can lead to some disappointments. I think, for instance, when we think about the last COP in Madrid, I think there was a striking gap between, on the one hand, the negotiations that were happening on a kind of business as usual scenario with endless arguing over technicalities in closed rooms. And then on the other hand, you had civil society really taking to the streets and demanding urgent climate action. And we could really see that gap between what was happening within the COP and outside the COP. So, of course, it can be quite disappointing if you're just thinking about what is usually a lack of progress at intergovernmental talks. But at the same time, the mere fact that we have citizens taking to the streets and that we see that elections now are becoming more and more about climate change, and that if citizens are given the knowledge about the scale of a climate problem, they have the power to ask for change, I think that really gives me hope.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Beck and Leslie-Anne. Okay, so to Emily now. Climate litigation is an increasingly central feature of the global climate landscape, especially as it involves non-state actors. So would you describe this, what's happening in courtrooms around the world, as another form of citizen participation?
Yes, courts are a place where citizens can go, can present their stories, can confront governments or non-state actors with their lack of action or their lack of ambition. And then there can be a kind of a tussle, a discussion about that lack of ambition or the lack of action on climate change. So yes, it is. There are some problems with it being an entirely reliable form of citizen participation because courts have various barriers to entry. Other kinds of participation, any citizen should be allowed to engage, but with courts, there are barriers in terms of what you can afford. Often this action is very expensive. And then also whether you are the right person to bring a case. So courts will often have strict rules about who is entitled to bring a particular action, because who is affected by the action will make a difference. So yes, courts can be an excellent place for citizen dialogue and citizen participation, but it's not an entirely accessible place.
Putting that just not to the side, but the stories of positive that I hear about courtroom action, I know there are a few examples around the world. What are the ones that you look to and the ones that might be having more impact?
Gosh, it's hard to say which ones have more impact. I suppose I can give you a flavour of the different types of action and then maybe see some of the patterns between them. So one of my favourite cases is a case from Colombia, which is in English is Future Generations. And it's against the Colombian government in respect to deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. And so this group of young people, it's about 26 young people, bring an action. It's called a TUELA action, which is to say that their rights are in urgent need of protecting because they will be very quickly impacted. And the court recognises that, yes, the deforestation of the Amazon, insofar as it contributes to climate change, is having a serious impact on the rights of these young people in Colombia. And so the court, in that case, gives the Amazon rainforest a legal identity, protects it as a kind of a natural being, and gives the Amazon rainforest rights, and says to the young people, yes, the government needs to be doing more to protect you now and in the future. So that's quite an exciting case. To give you a flavor, a totally different kind of case, we have an example in New Zealand where somebody who is living on an island off the coast of New Zealand is wanting to claim refugee status in New Zealand because of the impacts of climate change. The way that refugee law works is that unless you're fleeing some kind of persecution, you don't get to claim asylum in any country. That's kind of international refugee law. And so this person wanted to try and say, well, look, we need to adapt refugee law to this changing situation. I may not be fleeing persecution, but my life is uninhabitable on my home island. And there the court says, yes, we can see that this is a dire situation, but it's not in our gift to change refugee law. That has to be done at a kind of an international scale. So we see kind of a different shade of the problem of climate change, and of course, a very different reaction. I don't know if you want to hear some more cases. They
sound great to me. I'm enjoying them. I know that you said you've got a favourite at the beginning. Yes. You give me a few, and I'll decide which one's my favourite too.
Okay, cool. So I'll give you an Australian one, which is a little bit similar to the Colombian Future Generations case, because this is also a case brought by young people saying that the government in Australia has a duty of care to them to protect them from climate change. And this was in respect to a coal mine, the Whitehaven coal mine, and they wanted to stop an extension of the coal mine, this group of young people. And it's also an example of where you might win some parts of the case and not other parts of the case. So the court doesn't stop the extension of the coal mine, but it does rather radically recognise that the Minister of Environment in Australia has a legal duty to protect the rights of future generations and young people in Australia. And then I suppose I've left out two of the big ones, which I guess kind of brought this climate litigation to a more global audience. And both of them come from Holland. And I don't imagine many people thought that kind of Dutch jurisprudence would become so sexy, but it has. So in 2015, there's a case called Agenda, which is a case brought by a Dutch NGO, where again they're saying that the Dutch government's action in relation to climate change is not enough. And that's both as a matter of kind of domestic tort law, so what kind of the civil duties are of the Dutch government, but also as a matter of human rights, kind of in the human rights of Dutch citizens now and the future. So you see the similar pattern of the type of claimant in these cases. And the Agenda case was exciting because it's one of the first where the court said, yes, absolutely, there is a responsibility on the part of the government, and then they need to do more to address climate change. And this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court in the Netherlands. And whilst in the first court case, which is in the kind of the district court, they say we're not persuaded by the human rights arguments. By the time it gets to the Supreme Court, they're including kind of a human rights obligation as well as a civil obligation. So that's kind of the first of the big Dutch cases. And then the next one, which has only just begun, so we've just had the district court decision, is not against the government, but is against Royal Dutch Shell. And I'm not confident enough to be able to say the Dutch name of the organisation. So I'm just going to call it the Royal Dutch Shell case. And this was a case in which the NGO, amongst his kind of a group of NGOs, including Friends of the Earth, says that the emissions of Royal Dutch Shell are unlawful, and then they ought to be forced to reduce their emissions. And so the court again recognises that, yes, there is this problem, that Shell does have a duty to reduce their emissions, and that the actions of Royal Dutch Shell pose a danger to Dutch residents and serious human rights impacts.
This is all awesome, Emily. So I'm just wondering, what counts as success in these cases? Obviously, there are legal definitions of success, But as you mentioned briefly, there are some moments where you might win one aspect of a case, but not others. But what is this also about the public relations, the PR, the wider court of public opinion? How are people thinking about these issues?
I think that's a really important question, and one that we haven't necessarily asked ourselves in kind of a really careful way. So yes, you're right about bringing attention to these issues, that plays an important part of this litigation. And if you look at the Agenda case in particular, they had a very serious PR strategy behind the litigation. They have excellent videos, they have these very emotional scenes, and when they win the case where everyone's in tears that you watch and you're also in tears. So yes, PR and drawing more public attention to these issues is really important, and particularly because organizations like Agenda are purporting to represent the public in what they do. So this more global attention to climate litigation is certainly a measure of success. Of course, if that's your measure of success, then you have slight problems in that not all cases get the same attention, and not all litigants can afford a very expensive PR strategy. You may just be able to afford your litigation and not be able to issue your press statement. But you're right. I think that is an important part of the case. And actually, one of the ways I like to teach these climate litigation cases is to get students to draft a press statement, because how you then convey this to the rest of the world and to the press or the media is kind of a critical bit of climate litigation. The problem is kind of the legal success or the practical success. We don't really know yet because these cases are still quite new. If you look at, again, I'm going back to Agenda, the idea was to reduce emissions by 25% in 2020. And the decision wasn't finalized until 2020. So you may be aiming for something, and that took 5 years. So you may be aiming for something that you may never actually get. And then another problem is that you may aim for something, you might get the judgment that you wanted, and then how the government responds to that judgment is then completely out of your hands. So in the Colombian case of Future Generations, the court says, yes, we need to protect the Amazon rainforest. We give the Amazon rainforest its own legal identity and rights protection. And the government responds by then punishing the local communities who live in the forest. These are people who live in a kind of very low emission, low impact way, but they're an easy target. And this is actually quite a common tactic of governments to then target Indigenous or small populations and blame them for the damage to the forest or for the damage to the local environment, because they're much easier to target than the loggers or the kind of the big impact industries. So yes, measuring success is a bit difficult, and we need to think more carefully about it. There's an academic at Durham University called Kim Bauer, and she wrote this excellent article comparing climate litigation to the quests for the Holy Grail. And we have this massive mythology of the Holy Grail, where nobody really knows what the Holy Grail is, and nobody's really sure that they actually want to get the Holy Grail, because when they get it, sometimes the consequences are kind of terrible. So she uses this metaphor because actually it's quite an accurate representation of climate litigation. It looks good and fancy, and it's wonderful to have that judgment, but you're never really sure that that's actually what you want.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? I think one of the things, I guess, when I think about climate litigation is everything that you've said, Emily, as well as it's just one of the important things is it is placing pressure, at the front end. It is placing pressure. What happens at the back end and that notion of success, as you say, that is still a work in progress. But to have that another lever of pressure, I think can only be a good thing. And speaking of levers of pressure, I know that you've worked on a fascinating arts project on this theme around the rights of nature, or the voice of nature, which I think is wonderful. Can you tell us about that experience? I mean, that also is another lever, isn't it? It's another way of telling a story. It's another way of connecting and communicating these issues. But can you tell us about it and what effect you hope it might have?
I guess you've summarized it perfectly. It is about another form of pressure. And actually, throughout the history of environmental law, arts have been a form of pressure or a way to identify environmental problems. So if you look at kind of the 19th, 20th century, You have people like William Blake describing the Industrial Revolution as the dark satanic mills. In the US, you have Henry David Thoreau painting these beautiful pictures of nature as a way to preserve them. So arts have always played a role in trying to protect the environment. The project that I've been working on has been with an actor called Mark Knightley, and he got a grant to kind of develop his own practice in the form of 360-degree film, which is a way of filming it where you have a kind of a complete view of a scene. You would watch it on your phone and you would then be able to move around your viewpoint to see. So it's in theory, a very immersive form of film. And one of the things that Mark likes to do is to kind of get verbatim interviews and then turn that into a script. And so we worked on the Future Generation case in Colombia, which I mentioned at the beginning, because there are lots of nice narratives in that case, and kind of the arc of the story is quite dramatic. And so we interviewed a number of the claimants in that case, and it's turned into a script as a way to tell the story of the claimants. And courts are an excellent avenue for storytelling because it allows you to kind of put out your case to say, this is what's happening to me. But often with climate change litigation, it's just the court that gets to hear that story. The court then tells the rest of the world a version of that story, but you never really hear what the claimants are doing. So with this film, we wanted to try and bring the story that's hidden in the case out to a more public view. Because I firmly believe that stories are a compelling way to get people to respond or to change action or just to kind of get somebody to empathize with you. So through the film, we're telling both the story of the claimants, but also there's this character in the story that we kind of know is there, but we don't meet until the end. And that's the character of the trees of the forest. And actually there's kind of not big literature, but there are more and more books now. There's Richard Powers' Overstory or Elif Shafak, The Island of Missing Trees, where trees and forests are starting to play a role. So with this film, we're trying to give a place for the forest to shine.
Amazing. That's just amazing. So exciting. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Emily Barritt, and best wishes with the incredible work that you do.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
So, Virginia, let's focus now on the role of Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge as such an important, such a unique category of non-state actor, and incredibly powerful as well, and arguably untapped. So let's focus in on that area right now. How, from your perspective, are First Nation communities in Australia and even around the world being impacted by climate change? What's their stake in this?
I hate to say this, but I have to correct you on one thing, that we are not non-state actors as First Nations people. For any culture, especially Indigenous Australians, we lead the world because we've been here for 80,000 years plus, and we have been unfamiliar with being anything else but a sovereign people. And we also say as Indigenous Australians that we're unceded. So if we're unceded, we have to be a state actor. And we also represent civil society. So those are very important points to make quite clear. Many times in meetings, you would hear in Australia that people would introduce people through an acknowledgement of country and elders, past and present and emerging. And then you would acknowledge the importance of social capital, but intellectual capital that has and continues to be the foundation of Australia. But the sad situation is that many Indigenous people realise that to really be acknowledged and to have the right to govern in your own right needs structural reform. And I've written on this recently, which is what the United Nations have done many studies on, is the doctrine of discovery, and what we would say in international law terms as a framework of dominance. That works very much against that recognition quite plainly throughout not only Australia, but overseas as well, into many other Indigenous peoples areas, countries' sovereignty. And remember, in Mabo number 2 versus Queensland, a landmark High Court case, that the High Court judges would not touch sovereignty, would not entertain any areas or discussion on sovereignty. And cases thereafter have also not delved into those issues. But we run parallel. Our laws as Indigenous Australians runs parallel to the common law and to statutory legislation. So that's how we see the world as state actors. I hope that helps.
It does. I stand corrected, very much so, and happy to be so. And really important points, Virginia. So please keep talking. Tell us more. We need to know. We're thirsty for this knowledge. In particular, let's talk about this concept of sovereignty in the context of climate change. How do you frame that?
Well, there are a lot of issues that all of us around the world are suffering, which is COVID. And I'm supposed to be leaving for COP26 in a very short time. And it's really sad in many ways, because this was the hope of many Indigenous peoples attending COP26. And as Leslie-Anne said, being part of the negotiations, sitting at the table, discussing solutions and commonalities. And I noticed those discussions when I went to Mexico City for the United Nations preparatory talk before their New York discussions. And all of us from various parts of Indigenous nations across the world have commonalities. And we have commonalities in the experience of our issues, that we're very alarmed on climate change. Where I'm a postdoctoral fellow, my area, which is water security and also Aboriginal and Indigenous water rights, is really interesting, because, a lot of the issues that we talk about climate change, it isn't only climate change. It's water security. It's also the future of our next generations. It's our relationships as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We see that as siblings, as blood relationships with everything. A rock is not a rock to us. A landscape is not nature. It's a living, breathing, important relationship that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have with the skies above, with the earth below. Every part of that we live and breathe. And that's the most important thing that we discussed, and those commonalities and differences at Mexico City. But COP26 in Scotland will only have far less people, but with a determination that when we go and when we are at those Indigenous side events and discussions and other dialogue, that we are representing an immense responsibility to also be there for those who can't because of COVID, because of the losses that we've had across the world. So I think it's also a very solemn moment to really look inside ourselves and find that strength, that we're also there for others. I think that's essential to be there with COP.
This is, really harrowing to think of the ways that COVID has impacted communities around the world, but also people who we would hope to have at the table to do these climate negotiations. Virginia, would you be able to give me a flavour of either what Mexico City was like in terms of the sorts of stories, the talks that people gave from Indigenous perspectives, or a little bit perhaps what you might have hoped to have seen at Glasgow, if not for COVID, if we had been hearing all of those Indigenous voices around the world?
Well, I think the most important thing, and this stems from a lot of the Black Lives Matter discussions and webinars that I gave last year, and I come, as Beck does, from a major in sociology, so studied all the incredible insights and philosophies. But I think the one standout was when I was going on public transport in Mexico City, and there was a huge statue of Christopher Columbus actually with his hand outstretched. And what I had been told was that, here is all the wealth to be had. There's an immense opportunity here to take, what we basically want. And then last year, I saw that had changed radically because of Black Lives Matter. And it was that the statue of Christopher Columbus was taken down, and now a new statue honouring early Indigenous women is replacing it. Now, that is not just symbolism. That is a revolution. And that's what we're talking about. You know, Black Lives Matter and those events really go hand in hand with climate change and climate events and climate activism and youth activism. How wonderful is it that we have so many incredible young people that really want to stand up for these really important issues. When we had Juukan Gorge, for example, in Western Australia under very poor, very weak legislation to protect so-called Indigenous heritage, that 46,000-year-old cave was blown up. And what I have heard is that, you know, the elders and the elders' deepest grieving because of this loss, and also of those important artefacts that were also consisting of hair from people related to those who live today. Now, those sort of examples, as well as our inclination in governments to say, should we actually recognise the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in our legislation? Well, I saw that this was not as huge an issue as it is in Australia, but in Canada, BC, that they actually have UNDRIP in their legislation, even though it hasn't got legal effect. It still is a threshold, a measuring of how human rights standards will be addressed. Now, in Australia, we have led the course of events, and we've made history after the war in being very accomplished, and we've had great delegations that have gone over to discuss these issues. And I'm very hopeful, like many others, that we will have those passionate people who really know that our structure needs to be reformed, not only in law, in the way that we actually view marginalised people, those vulnerable people who are on social welfare, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So, you know, because of climate change, because of our back turning, that we have a situation of flooding events, heating events in Australia, and we have very marginalised, vulnerable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and Torres Strait Islander communities that are now seeing their island being covered by water because of rising sea levels. So, you know, we're really in a situation that's an emergency. And we have to really gather our thoughts and stand next to these incredibly passionate young people to really revive our sense of what's important. So those are the chief issues that we have today. And that was something that we discussed in Mexico City. And I'm hoping that dialogue and the speaking events that I will be attending will really harness that passion. This is not a theoretical or an academic exercise.
Thank you so much, Virginia. And I think exactly, it's not a theoretical or academic exercise. This is real life knocking on our door now. And I think you've also tapped on something. It's been knocking for quite a few decades, hundreds of years. But I think you've touched on something that it would be great to explore a little bit more about, which is certainly the vulnerability of certain communities, but also including Indigenous communities, but also the inherent knowledge and power inherent in those communities. What can you tell us? How can you educate us about Indigenous Australian approaches to land and to water that can better inform approaches to sustainability generally?
Well, I think that the most important thing I can say to you is fire. That was an incredible experience by Australians over the past 12 to 18 months, is when we had horrific fires, and we saw them all over the world, especially in California and Greece, for example. But in Australia, this was a different type of fire. And I remember going and walking the streets in Canberra. It looked like a war zone. The air was very thick. You could smell burning leaves. It went dark very early when I was walking back to my unit in Canberra. And it was a sense of fear from so many people. But the conversations were really interesting. And this goes to people talking about cool fire burns and the way that traditional Aboriginal people and people today have revitalised those incredible fire management practices, that this could be one of the very important knowledge areas that Aboriginal people could share with the rest of Australia. And then it was talked as well in climate change dialogue in and across Australia. And then when we had the Royal Commission into Disasters in New South Wales, there was a dedicated chapter to cool fire practices from Aboriginal people, which was a first. I'd never seen anything of that type before. So the fires that we experienced brought that crisis conversation and how to actually harness and share knowledge with Aboriginal people. And that was very, very important, because when I was writing the article that I was speaking to you about the doctrine of discovery, looking at Bill Gamage's work from ANU called The Biggest Estate on Earth, and the archived material that he found was from those early 1800s to the late 1700s of the First Fleet, that there were observations, regular observations of native peoples burning the land. Because burning the land, as we know as Aboriginal people, it thrives, it helps the waterways, it burns off excess fuel. We've been talking about that for years in the national park regimes. So that is critical, and that conversation was critical. And I think the other one we're having now is water and drought. It's not just every 10 years now. It's a regular occurrence. And so the fires will be as well. And I think as the co-chair for the National Water Reform Committee, which was appointed through a government department, but we are all Indigenous from different people across this country, we're trying now to reform National Water Initiative, which will be a really challenging area because that takes into account climate change for the first time. The blueprint for water trading, for example, did not take into account climate change. And that's very serious because we know sustainability development goals, goal 13, is that this is a critical part of creating legislation and also creating national policy that brings in those issues, policies, experience for climate change and how we adapt or how we mitigate. So I think that that's a very new way of doing business, and also using our intellectual property comes to the fore when I sit on the ANU Ethics Committee, is that I can see that there's a growing interest now to work with the concept of Indigenous-led research. And that is really important. For years, we've been objectified and we've been interviewed and we've been participants. But, the critical factor is that we're now being more conscious in non-Indigenous society to then allow us to experience what Indigenous-led research is. And I think that's also a conversation at COP, because research, whether it's corporate or non-corporate, is immense opportunities. And I've been working for the last 10 years as a pro bono lawyer for an Aboriginal community on Aboriginal medicine. And I can tell you the swiftness that we've gone through COVID and the various drugs that are being used to counter the COVID virus is that for Indigenous medicines, there's more barriers than you can imagine. And it's been a very slow process. And there aren't any Aboriginal committee members on the Therapeutic Goods Administration. There's no policy for Aboriginal medicines, but there are keen interests from overseas, of course, for Aboriginal medicines. And They've been known from our communities to cure cancer, to deal with a whole range of issues that we have from day to day. And so, there's so much that we can do, but my concern is that we have to take steps of building those relationships and building that trust, because after 233 years of massacre, assimilation, theft of land and water, theft of identity, and also a lack of reluctance, like the Uluru Statement from the Heart, the inspiring document that calls for us to be humble and find that humility, to work with Indigenous peoples. That is so, so important to us as human beings. And that's what we've made a call to Australia. And we will make this call to the world in COP26. That is a significant part of what I believe my message will be.
Virginia, thank you so much. It's fascinating and amazing to hear the stories of Indigenous knowledge here in Australia being incorporated and brought into various decision-making processes and land governance processes that we know have been dominated by, here in Australia and around the world, by Western systems of governance, colonial systems of governance, and Western systems of science. And it's amazing to see a shift. I wonder if you could comment as we close this out. What are the lessons that we, and by we I mean non-Indigenous and Australians or people around the world, can take to understand how we bring together Indigenous systems of knowledge in other places around the world or in Australia to work towards better management, better dealing with the issues here and solving these problems into the future?
Well, I think in Australia we have this little ditty that says we're all in this together, but actually we're not. Some people just are not included. And we've seen that with vulnerable people across Australia, and especially people with disability, for example, homeless people being very hard hit. So I think that what we need to do is relinquish some of our power, and especially in the academy, we need to do that desperately. We need to talk more about the human-to-human effects of our impact. And I think that's the take-home message of really understanding that we're not talking about instruments or law. We're not talking about policies. We're not taking that very unemotional, and we're not unbiased, as we know. We need to really open ourselves up. And I guess that's, again, coming back to Uluru Statement from the Heart, is opening our hearts to a new way of thinking and teaching and breathing and living. That will be the message that Indigenous peoples will let everyone know, that we have to do business differently. And that will create a huge positive effect, and the domino effects that we know is so important. And we've seen it in Black Lives Matter, from the one death of a very distressed human being in America had created a trigger of incredible humanity. So let's not wait for another example like that. Let's just take on board that change.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Let's all remember we are all in this together. It's been an absolutely amazing conversation. I don't know, Megan. I've heard so many wonderful things and so many hopeful things that I'm going to take away from here as we head towards COP26 in Glasgow.
That's absolutely right. And one of the things particularly that I really want to emphasize is, flowing on from Virginia's final words there, this podcast series, we started in episode 1 with the theme that we protect what we love, and that part of our job as responsible human beings is to fall in love with nature again, with the world again. And this episode has shown us, I think, and I've had goosebumps for pretty much this whole episode. This episode has shown us that this is taking place around the world. It needs to happen so much more, but it is taking place around the world, and that such love can take many forms, and it includes setting boundaries, and it includes speaking up as much as collaboration and compassion and cooperation. I feel very humbled, and I feel strangely hopeful So I want to thank all of our speakers. Thank you so much to all of our incredible guests here today, a real powerhouse of female leadership and talent with Dr. Leslie-Anne Duvic-Paoli, Dr. Rebecca Pearse, Dr. Virginia Marshall, and Dr. Emily Barritt, and an incredible episode. Thank you to all of our speakers.
This was a special production by the Australian National University and King's College London. Our producers were Lamise Kazat, James Bagley, and Julia Staposka, with editing from Rachel Wall and music from Dean Smith.